Berlin, April 1945. The heart of the Third Reich is crumbling under the weight of 1,000 Allied bombs. Soviet tanks are closing in from the east. American forces push from the west. The air is thick with smoke, panic, and the bitter knowledge that the war is lost. Hitler is locked in his Führer bunker beneath the Chancellery, issuing orders to divisions that no longer exist. Above ground, the once proud capital is a shattered shell, reduced to rubble and whispers. High-ranking officials vanish like smoke in the chaos. Some flee, some kill themselves, others simply disappear. Among them, Colonel Friedrich Adler, a decorated intelligence officer with a reputation for cold precision and unnerving calm. He wasn't a name the public knew, but in certain circles, his presence always meant something was being hidden. His role was rarely discussed aloud. Even within Hitler's inner circle, Adler was an enigma. Fluent in 6 languages, a master of cryptography, and a strategist with a gift for vanishing behind layers of bureaucracy. He didn't wear medals, and no photos of him were ever released to the press. But he was there at Wolf's Lair, at Nuremberg, and finally in Berlin. Documents later declassified hinted at Adler's involvement in continuity operations, classified programs designed to preserve Nazi leadership in case of collapse. His name appeared beside code names like Werewolf and Silbergrau, shadowy initiatives never meant to see daylight. In the final days, Adler was reportedly seen speaking with Martin Bormann and Heinrich Himmler, both men already plotting escape. And then, nothing. No funeral, no arrest, no grave. Just a signature on a departure manifest, a convoy that rolled out of Berlin under the cover of smoke, and a long silence that would stretch nearly 80 years. For decades, Adler's name would be whispered among conspiracy theorists and Cold War historians, an invisible thread in a tapestry of Nazi escape routes, buried gold, and post-war secrets. But even they couldn't agree on one thing. Did Friedrich Adler die in the ashes of the Reich? Or was his war only just beginning? April 28, 1945. As Soviet artillery shells explode across Berlin's skyline, a convoy of 3 dark-colored staff cars slips quietly out of the capital under false papers and forged orders. Witnesses, if there were any, would have seen only silhouettes behind the glass, men in plain uniforms with blank insignia. One of them was Colonel Friedrich Adler. According to a fragment of a report found years later in a crumbling East German archive, Adler had been issued an emergency exfiltration order, destination Mittenwald, near the Austrian border. The convoy's path was logical, threading through the Black Forest under assumed identities, blending with the chaos of fleeing officers and scattered Wehrmacht units. But somewhere near the foothills of the Bavarian Alps, the trail ends. Completely. No radio transmissions, no sightings, no wreckage. 3 vehicles vanish without a trace. Days later, American forces secure the region. They find an abandoned staff car near Lake Walcheren, doors open, engine cold. Inside, forged passports, 2 empty canisters of morphine, and a blood-stained map marked with a crude X deep within the mountains. No bodies, no dog tags, no explanation. The case goes cold before it's ever opened. Allied intelligence suspected suicide, desertion, or that Adler had crossed into Austria under a new name. But none of the leads stuck. For decades, nothing else surfaced. His name appeared in a few declassified OSS files, suspected sightings in Buenos Aires, unconfirmed intelligence linking him to post-war fascist movements, but each time the trail evaporated into smoke. Family members never claimed his pension, no death certificate was ever issued. His Nazi Party file was mysteriously expunged. It was as if Friedrich Adler had been erased, not just from Germany, but from history itself. And yet, rumors persisted. Locals in small Alpine villages whispered of a strange man seen once or twice after the war, silent, pale, always alone. A farmer's son remembered hearing German radio signals coming from a distant ridge late at night. Nothing provable, nothing concrete, but enough to keep the myth alive. Because Adler wasn't just another officer who disappeared in the fog of war. He was the man who vanished on purpose. And what no one could explain, not even now, was why. For those who lived in the shadow of the Bavarian Alps, the war never truly ended. The gunfire faded, the troops left, the swastikas were torn down, but something lingered in the trees. Over time, the locals stopped speaking openly about it. They said the mountains didn't forget. That after 1945, certain trails grew colder, certain paths seemed less welcoming. Hunters would return early, uneasy, claiming they saw someone moving through the fog just beyond the tree line. It always started the same way. Strange lights deep in the forest, flickering as if from an oil lamp or radio equipment. Not fire, not electricity, something in between. Then came the sounds. Short bursts of static like Morse code. Snatches of German whispered too clearly to be the wind. One shepherd swore he saw a figure standing above a glacial ravine at dusk, watching the village with binoculars. When he returned with others the next morning, there were no prints in the snow. In towns like Garmisch, Oberammergau, and Mittenwald, people began to talk quietly, cautiously about the man in the ridge. Children whispered about the ghost colonel, a faceless man with a long coat and a rifle who lived in a stone house hidden by roots and time. Adults dismissed it as mountain folklore, a blend of guilt and superstition, but even they locked their doors earlier in winter. Some said it was just deserters, broken soldiers who refused to surrender, eking out survival in caves or old hunting cabins. Others believed it was something more calculated, a secret bunker, a last-ditch hideout for Nazi elites. They spoke of Schattensiedlungen, shadow settlements, rumored strongholds built in the final months of the war, supplied with rations, radio gear, and false identities. One persistent tale involved an old game warden who stumbled on a metal hatch in the woods in 1953. He claimed it led to a reinforced bunker and that someone was still living there, books, preserved food, even hot coals in the fireplace. When he returned with police, the hatch was gone. The soil freshly disturbed. No official report was filed. He left town a year later. Whether truth or myth, one name always floated to the surface of these stories like a dead leaf in mountain runoff: Adler. Colonel Friedrich Adler, the man who vanished, the man the forest never gave back. By the 1972nd, the story of Colonel Friedrich Adler had morphed from intelligence file to campfire tale. It wasn't just a missing person case anymore, it was folklore. The kind that lived in yellowed newspapers, conspiracy books, and late-night conversations between Cold War spooks who still remembered how the Reich nearly clawed its way into the future. But for a few, the case never went cold. It calcified, hardened into obsession. Nazi hunters combed through post-war visa logs, interviewing ex-soldiers and former party members in Argentina, Chile, and Paraguay. Some were convinced Adler made it to South America under a false name, part of the same ghost convoy that carried Mengele and Eichmann into the shadows. But Adler's name never surfaced in the rat lines. Not once. That was unusual. Men of his rank didn't just vanish without a whisper. British and American journalists tried too. In the 1980 seconds, a BBC reporter named Ian Mercer trekked through the Alps with a camera crew, filming a documentary on Nazi escape routes. They found remnants of war bullet casings, old outposts, rusted bed frames, but no sign of a secret cabin. The episode aired once, then disappeared from the archives. Mercer refused interviews afterward. A French historian named Claudine Bisset published a book in 1991, claiming Adler had been part of a failed coup against Hitler in early '45 and was executed in secret. But when researchers tried to verify her sources, they found nothing but forged documents and dead phone numbers. Over time, the world moved on. Other names filled the vacuum, bigger villains, louder ghosts. But Adler lingered in the margins, notorious in silence. In 2005, a German university funded a digital project to track missing high command officers from the Third Reich. Adler's file was labeled Status Unbekannt, unknown. No grave, no papers, no fingerprints. Just a list of skills and a final destination no one ever reached. Eventually, even the Nazi hunters gave up. The money dried up, the Cold War ended, governments stopped looking, and the forest, indifferent as ever, kept its secret. But stories have a way of surviving where records fail. And when the hiker wandered off that ridge 78 years later and saw something glinting beneath the moss, he wouldn't just stumble on an old cabin. He would tear a hole straight through the myth. The 17th of June, 2023. It was supposed to be a solo hike, nothing more than a quiet escape from the noise of everyday life. Lucas Meyer, a 1-year-old schoolteacher from Interlaken, was following an unmarked game trail above the tree line in the Bernese Alps, camera slung across his shoulder, breath thin in the high-altitude air. He wasn't looking for anything, just solitude. A few hours into the ascent, he veered east into a steep ravine rarely used by hikers, drawn by the sound of meltwater rushing below. That's when he saw it. Just above a limestone outcrop, half covered in pine needles and alpine grass, was something that didn't belong, a crooked column of stone rising no more than a meter from the ground, its top blackened and cracked. A chimney, or what was left of one. At its base, warped sheets of rusted metal jutted from the earth at odd angles, like the ribcage of something long dead. Lucas crouched to clear the debris. Beneath the dirt, he uncovered fragments of glass, collapsed timber beams, and what looked like the corner of a trapdoor reinforced with iron brackets. His heart kicked harder. This wasn't a shepherd's hut or an old hunting cabin. Whatever this was, it had been buried intentionally. He took photos, marked the coordinates, and returned to the nearest ranger station. At first, the officials dismissed him until they saw the images. Within 48 hours, the site was cordoned off. Alpine authorities, Swiss military historians, and preservation experts were flown in. A week later, the story had spread across Europe. An unidentified World War II structure discovered in a remote sector of the Alps. But the truth would prove far stranger. What Lucas found wasn't a bunker, and it wasn't empty. Hidden beneath decades of ice and rock was a sealed world, untouched since the day its door last closed. What the mountains had hidden for nearly 80 years was not just a ruin, it was a secret waiting to be exhumed, and inside, something was still waiting to be found, something that had no business surviving the end of the war. The excavation began quietly. No headlines, no press, just a rotating crew of Alpine engineers and forensic experts operating under tight discretion. The site was fragile, partially collapsed, and perched dangerously above a frozen runoff. It took 6 days to clear the overgrowth and begin safely opening what was quickly identified as an underground structure reinforced with rebar and concrete. Not a bunker, as originally believed, but something stranger, a personal cabin, designed not for defense, but for survival. Built into the mountain with shocking precision, the structure was partially preserved by permafrost. Inside, a single narrow staircase led into a chamber no larger than a freight container, insulated with wool-lined paneling and paneled in pine, the air thick with mildew and decay. But it wasn't empty. A table sat in the center, bolted to the floor. A rusted enamel coffee cup rested beside a leather-bound journal, its pages brittle but intact. Along the back wall, a narrow cot, fur blanket still folded neatly on top. Beside it, a kerosene lamp, a broken wristwatch, and a Luger pistol with one round missing. In a sealed storage niche, investigators found tin rations stamped with 1,944 expiry dates, a wooden crate of bottled mineral water, and medical supplies labeled in archaic German script. Then, in the far corner, partially hidden beneath a canvas tarp, was a body, slumped upright, arms crossed over the chest. Mummified by cold, the figure was almost intact, its clothing unmistakably military. When they removed the field jacket, they found a worn leather wallet. Inside was a faded photograph of a young woman, a ration card, and a Nazi identification paper bearing the name Oberst Friedrich Adler. The press was alerted within 72 hours. Historians from across Europe were summoned. DNA verification would follow, but inside the military circles there was little doubt. After 78 years, the ghost had a face. The journal would reveal much, but not everything. Because in that small cabin, sealed in ice and silence, were clues that pointed to something even stranger than Adler's survival. Something planned, something deliberate. A war that didn't end in 1945, but simply went underground. The body was airlifted to Bern under military escort. Forensic pathologists from the Swiss Institute for Legal Medicine handled the remains with extreme care, temperature-controlled transport, protective casing, zero exposure to humidity. Though partially mummified, the preservation was remarkable. The cold hadn't just slowed decomposition, it had suspended it. Tissue samples were taken, bone marrow was extracted. Dental records, though scarce, were compared to what little remained in the Reich's fragmented archives. But the breakthrough came from a single living connection, a descendant. Maria Adler, a retired nurse in Munich, had submitted her DNA to a genealogy database years earlier. When the sample was matched against the mitochondrial DNA pulled from the cabin remains, the result was irrefutable. 99.87% certainty. The man in the mountain was Colonel Friedrich Adler. What followed was not a celebration, but a shift in tone. The mystery had changed shape. It was no longer about a man who disappeared, it was about a man who had chosen not to return. The autopsy revealed no signs of trauma, no gunshot, no blunt force, no obvious cause of death. There were faint traces of cardiac tissue damage, suggesting heart failure or hypothermia, but nothing definitive. Time of death was estimated between 1,946 and 1,948. He had survived the war, lived through it, alone, long enough for his rations to dwindle, long enough for frost and time to reclaim the world outside his door. But why stay? Why let the war end around him without ever emerging? No one hides for 3 years in a self-built tomb unless they believe there's still something to fear or something to wait for. The questions piled higher than the snow outside the cabin's ruins. If Adler had survived the fall of Berlin, built this hideout, and then died silently within it, what else had he left behind? The answers lay not in the bones, but in the items sealed beside them, pages not yet read, codes not yet broken, and a journal waiting to speak after nearly 80 years of silence. Inside, a weathered footlocker at the far end of the cabin, hidden beneath stacks of folded uniforms and grease-slicked tools, investigators found what they had been hoping for and what they feared. Dozens of items, each a relic of intention. Military-grade maps with cryptic markings, stacks of Reichsmarks bundled in twine, several passports bearing false names and fabricated birthplaces, and a journal, thick, bound in cracked leather, sealed by a rusted clasp. It belonged to Adler. His name was scrawled on the first page, dated the 23rd of April 1945. Each entry was tight, precise, written in a cold, almost mechanical hand. The opening pages detailed his escape from Berlin, coded references to safe routes, extraction points, and shifting orders. Later entries grew darker. He writes of silence, of isolation, of shortwave messages that never came. Then, halfway through the journal, one page was folded, dog-eared, and marked with a red X. The date was the 9th of May, 1945, the day after Germany's official surrender. The ink on that page was different, darker, rushed. The message was brief. No transmission. Repeater dead. Silbergrau failed. No contact. Remaining in place. Awaiting signal. Beneath that, a final line. They think it's over. It's not. The discovery sent ripples through the intelligence community. What was Silbergrau? The term didn't appear in any Allied records. Not werewolf, not Odessa, something else. A contingency? A second phase? The journal offered no further details, but in another crate they found parts of a shortwave transmitter. It had been modified, calibrated to frequencies used by Reich, broadcasting infrastructure long-range, encrypted. Near it, a steel tin of vacuum tubes. He had been trying to reach someone, or waiting for someone to reach him. The maps told their own story markings across Switzerland, Austria, northern Italy. Circles drawn around caves, remote structures, forgotten mountain passes, places that could hide more than one man. Among the final pages of the journal was a list of names, some with lines drawn through them, others untouched. Each name was followed by a code name. One of them read, Rheiniger, Glacier Watch. The cabin wasn't just a hideout, it was a post, a listening station, a dead man's embassy from a world that refused to die quietly. The final entry in Colonel Adler's journal is dated the 2nd of November, 1947. The handwriting is unsteady, less rigid than the early pages, as if written with a trembling hand or a failing mind. The ink bleeds at the edges, smeared in places, but the words are clear enough to read. And what they reveal is not just the closing thoughts of a dying man, but a mission unfinished. I was never meant to write this. The order was verbal, direct, not for history. The entry opens with that sentence, underlined twice. It sets the tone immediately. This wasn't reflection. It was confession. Phase 3 failed. All channels silent since May 46. No return code, no fallback coordinates. I am compromised only in isolation. That is my security. Adler writes in fragments, using a mixture of military jargon and personal cryptic phrasing, but one word repeats more than any other: Silbergrau. He refers to it not as a project, but a directive, something preordained by what he calls the circle behind the circle language, eerily similar to Nazi occult or intelligence code words. They did not betray me. I was betrayed with them. Our role was final, the spine of the new structure, not its face. We were never to return. We were to wait. Long enough for the rot to be washed out. Long enough for memory to become myth. Then he names names. Not many, but enough. Reiniger, Stoll, Bremer. Codename, Talstein. Each name is associated with a function: communications, logistics, perimeter. Some are underlined. Some are crossed out. Silbergrau was never for victory. It was for the next beginning. Berlin was already gone. We knew it. That's why we were chosen. Not to fight. To remain. The most chilling line comes near the end of the entry, where Adler seems to acknowledge what his silence has cost him. I no longer believe rescue is coming, but I also do not believe I am alone. We were too many, too careful. They will emerge, somewhere, someday. And then, the last line scrawled across the bottom of the page like a warning or a prayer. History forgets, but the gray never sleeps. The journal ends there. No signature, no goodbye. Just an echo from a man who believed he had vanished into purpose. But what was Operation Silbergrau really? And how many others had vanished into its shadow? Until the cabin's discovery, the name Silbergrau existed only in rumors. Among war historians, it was the kind of term that showed up in late-night forums, half-burned memos, and footnotes so redacted they were practically black. Now, with Adler's journal in hand, investigators had something they never expected: proof the operation was real. Declassified Allied intelligence files from 1946 and 47 revealed a pattern fragments of intercepted German communications referencing Phase 2 Alpine continuity, and more notably, a phrase buried in a British field report: Evidence suggests a secondary network possibly designated Silbergrau intended to seed leadership cells in remote terrain. The report was dismissed at the time. British intelligence believed it to be exaggerated paranoia fueled by misinformation campaigns during the Reich's collapse. After all, the war was over, or so they thought. The term Silbergrau translates to silver gray, a color associated with SS uniforms, but also used in Nazi intelligence as code for silent operatives, men chosen not for battle, but for disappearance. These were officers not absorbed into Odessa or caught in post-war tribunals. They were the ones who simply went missing, faded into the mountains, into South America, into the background. The theory grew darker. If Silbergrau was real, then Adler's cabin wasn't an outlier, it was a node in a network, a waiting post, a place designed not for survival in the wilderness, but observation. A team of archivists working with Swiss and Austrian military historians discovered a 1,945 topographical file stamped Kanzler Augen, Chancellor's Eyes, referencing 5 potential fallback sites embedded within neutral or hard-to-reach terrain. One was located near the Italian border. Another matched the exact ridge where Adler's cabin was found. These weren't bunkers, they were stations, designed to be invisible, built to last for decades, populated by men handpicked to carry the flame through darkness. Operation Silbergrau, it seemed, wasn't about escape. It was about hibernation. A contingency for a future that never came, or perhaps one that still might. Because if one cabin was found, what about the others? There was no sign Adler ever left the cabin once he arrived. The supplies he brought, rations, water, medical kits, had been methodically inventoried in a separate notebook found beside his cot. Each item logged with dates, quantities, and notations in tight script. He had prepared to wait. But for how long? His journal entries grew sparse after 1946. The confident codes and brisk observations of 1,945 were replaced by shorter phrases, more reflective and erratic. Notes about the cold, about rationing, about shortwave silence. One repeated line stood out through the pages like a heartbeat. "The world forgets, but I will not." The transmitter had long gone dead by then. Burn marks around its wiring suggested it had been overworked, perhaps used nightly for months. Investigators believe Adler may have kept broadcasting into static, sending coded pulses into a void, hoping someone, somewhere, was still listening. Yet, even as the world rebuilt, Adler didn't come down from the mountain. He didn't resurface. He didn't flee to South America like others in his rank. His purpose wasn't escape. It was obedience. What drove him was not survival, it was belief. There were indications he remained active into at least early 1947. A torn calendar nailed to the wall was marked through February. Below it, one last entry, dated March 11. "I remain. No orders received. Perimeter holding. Transmission failed. Faith intact." After that, the pages stop. No record of illness, no farewell. The last few pages of the journal are blank. The silence is louder than any coded message. A man who had written obsessively, tracking every tin ration, every atmospheric shift, every missed signal, simply stopped. Some believe Adler succumbed to the elements. Others think he made a choice, his mission complete, or broken by the weight of isolation. But the way his cabin was left meticulously organized, journal locked, pistol undisturbed, suggests a man still waiting, even in death. Whatever Operation Silbergrau was meant to be, Adler believed it with his final breath, and that belief may not have died with him, because what investigators found next suggested something far bigger than one man in one cabin. The discoveries came in layers. Beneath a false bottom in Adler's supply crate, investigators uncovered a bundle of documents wrapped in oilcloth. Inside, maps, loose-leaf notes, and a hand-drawn grid scrawled on parchment yellowed by time. The grid was primitive, just lines and crude topography, but the symbols on it were unmistakable: crosses, X's, and black triangles scattered across the Central Alps. Each was numbered, some were circled, others violently scratched out. At first, it seemed like a paranoid's attempt to chart the mountains. But overlaid with modern terrain maps, the implications became clear. These were not natural features. They were positions, possible coordinates of cabins like Adler's, hidden strongholds, caches, or escape routes. Not all in Switzerland. Some extended into Austria, northern Italy, and even southern Germany. More names appeared in the margins, not full names, code names most likely. Reiniger, Voslicht, Alpstein, Tanna. Some were accompanied by dates. Others by single-word functions: medic, engineer, watcher. 7 of the names had been crossed out with hard black slashes. 10 remained untouched. What did the markings mean? Had these individuals died, been compromised, or had they successfully completed their part of the operation and moved on to something else? Also among the papers was a list labeled Übergangsstellen, transition points. These appeared to be covert passes or trails between key locations. One was later identified as a disused mine tunnel sealed in 1944 after a landslide. Another matched the area near the Swiss-Italian border, where locals once reported seeing armed men traveling at night during the war's final days. One document, barely legible and written in a cipher Adler had used in his earlier journal, contained a phrase repeated 3 times: "The ice holds." No explanation, no context, just those words. Historians and military analysts now believe Operation Silbergrau may have included a network of Alpine watchers, men like Adler, embedded and isolated, tasked with waiting, observing, and reporting. A parallel chain of operatives buried in mountains and silence, beyond the reach of conventional history. If even one other cabin still existed, if even one of those names was still alive, the implications would shake the foundation of what we thought we knew about the end of the war. Because Adler didn't just vanish, he was stationed. And he wasn't meant to be alone. Long before the excavation teams arrived, before the headlines and the DNA tests, the villagers in the valleys below the ridge already had a name for that part of the mountain: Der Schattenkamm, the Shadow Ridge. It was a place avoided more out of habit than fear, where the trees grew too thick and the silence felt too deep. Investigators combed the nearby towns for anyone old enough to remember the immediate post-war years. What they found were stories, half-whispers, folk memories, and warnings passed down like old superstitions. One woman, Erika Junt, now 89, remembered her grandfather's words from when she was a child in 1946. "Don't go near the stone ridge. The ghost of the soldier lives there." At the time, she thought it was nonsense, a story meant to keep children from wandering too far. But she also remembered the night he came back from the high trails, pale and quiet, muttering something about a lantern flickering where no man should be. Another man, Jakob Suter, a retired hunter now in his 90s, claimed he once encountered a stranger that same year. He had been trapping rabbits near the upper ravine when he saw a man in worn military gear descending toward a stream. He didn't speak much, Jakob recalled. But he had perfect German, no accent. He offered me 2 Swiss coins for a loaf of bread. His eyes looked like they hadn't seen a human in years. Jakob never saw him again. Some villagers spoke of finding broken footprints in the snow that led to nowhere. Others remembered hearing what sounded like shortwave radio pulses at night, faint, rhythmic, like a heartbeat in the static. None of it was reported. None of it documented. In post-war Europe, people were trying to forget, not investigate. But when photos of the cabin were released, and Adler's face, a face not seen since 1945, appeared in newspapers, many in those mountain villages said only one thing: "We always knew something was up there." And quietly, in private, a few confessed something even stranger, that they weren't sure he was ever truly alone. The discovery didn't just make headlines, It shook institutions. Across Europe, military historians, archivists, and intelligence veterans scrambled to re-examine decades of assumptions. The body of Colonel Friedrich Adler was no longer a question, it was an answer. But to what, exactly, remained elusive. For some, it was closure. Another missing Nazi confirmed dead, another loose end tied off in the complex knot of post-war history. Museums in Berlin and Munich requested the cabin's artifacts for preservation. Academic journals published articles debating whether Silbergrau was a legitimate plan or the delusion of a loyalist who couldn't accept defeat. But others weren't so sure. Intelligence officials in both Switzerland and Germany quietly reopened long-dormant files. The Vatican archives, long accused of shielding post-war fugitives, received new scrutiny. And beneath the surface of formal politics, a new kind of unease emerged, because if Adler had survived undetected for years, who else might have? In online forums and fringe podcasts, the rumors ignited like wildfire. Silbergrau was no longer myth. It was real, and the Alpine silence had just cracked. Some called it an unfinished plan. Others feared it was an active one, waiting not for orders, but for opportunity. The Swiss government responded quickly. The site was sealed, no public access. Excavation teams were rotated weekly under military watch. Independent investigators were denied entry. Officially, this was to preserve the fragile structure. Unofficially, it was to prevent the spread of what one internal memo called sensitive implications regarding unresolved post-war operations. In the nearby towns, tourists began arriving, true crime enthusiasts, war history buffs, and conspiracy seekers. But the locals didn't speak. They watched and waited. Because for them, it wasn't news. It was memory. And memory, in the Alps, never truly melts away. Snow falls softly now over the ruins, erasing the outlines of what once was. The cabin, what remains of it, is little more than stone, frost, and silence, a faded warning buried in ice. The excavation tents have been packed up. The soldiers rotated out. The lights turned off. No plaque marks the spot. No monument stands for Colonel Friedrich Adler. Colonel Friedrich Adler vanished in 1945, but the world he died waiting for never came. And maybe, just maybe, that's the only reason we're still here. No answers. Just the weight of history settling back into the earth. And somewhere, beneath the snow, the ghost of the soldier still watching. This story was brutal, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.